Today, I'm at the Civil War battlefield of Chickamauga, and I'm here to learn about World War I. Learn more about that fascinating connection coming up next.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, everyone for liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, stop today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud our boys in line. Over there, send the word over there.
Well, very cool. So first off, I'd like to welcome you guys to Chickamauga Battlefield. My name is Chris. I'm one of the park rangers here. And these guys are living historians from all over the place. You guys well, except for Chip. Chip sprang from the earth here at Chickamauga Battlefield. He was molded from the clay of this ground. So the earth budded here, I suppose. So most people, when they visit this battlefield, when they visit Chickamauga, we kind of think about this as being a Civil War landscape primarily. Particularly where we're standing here, Snodgrass Hill is kind of the defining moment and defining place of Chickamauga. Right? This is the place where the Union Army kind of does this last stand. And this is one of the places most visitors come up here. We got to see the Rock of Chickamauga and talking about George Thomas and in this. But what ends up happening here is that this park gets created in August of 1890, and it gets created, because of the battle. But at the end of the day, the park did not originally exist to necessarily be a memorial landscape. The idea of a national military park was to be a park for the military, right? So if you see that term on national park sites, Gettysburg National Military Park, Vicksburg National Military Park, Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. Those are parks that were created to be kind of outdoor classrooms for the military. And so what they did was these places were preserved, and they allowed the veterans to come out and put monuments up all over the place, marking where soldiers were and everything. But at the end of the day, the purpose of this park was for guys like these guys to come out here and train. The first time that happened here was during the Spanish-American War, but 100 years ago this summer, in the summer of 1917, kind of this whole side of the battlefield gets taken over as a World War I training depot. And so to kind of give you guys just a very quick kind of illustration of that, and we do that since it's kind of a small group here, this is a photo taken out in the field down beneath us here, kind of looking up towards the cabin. And you can see just how much damage is being done. And so kind of the story of this place, bring this over here for you guys, kind of the story of this battlefield, the story of what was happening here 100 years ago is kind of the story of preservation. Right? Today when we talk about battlefields, we talk about we got to preserve these places. We talk about monuments. We say don't take down the monuments, don't damage the monuments. But 100 years ago, the country was thinking very differently. We were willing to destroy this place by digging it up, by popping metal off of monuments to melt it for scrap. We were willing to kind of destroy this landscape of the last war in order to win the current war. In the Civil War, kind of famously, President Lincoln talks about the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Well, in 1917, they're saying if we don't win that war to make the world safe for democracy, nothing that happened here in 1863 matters. This place is the price of securing kind of long-term the ideals that this war wins, which is an interesting kind of thing to think about. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lewis here, who's hiding from me. Lewis is a local historian and living historian who runs a small museum and shop kind of up here in town, and he is the verified expert here on World War I. I know enough to get in trouble, and so I'm gonna turn it over to Lewis to give you guys a little bit of the details of kind of what was happening here in the battlefield. So, Lewis,
yeah, man, your check's in the mail. That was a pretty good intro.
All right, cool.
All right, obviously Chris kind of opened it up for this. The park has seen a lot of other usage, obviously, other than just those 3 days in September of 1863. But the average visitor does not know that. And so, say in 1898, when the Spanish-American War began, 70,000 men trained here. The entire camp, the entire park is taken up by the camp. Around 70,000 men are training here. The Spanish-American War ends very quickly, so the majority of men training here never see combat. However, Camp Thomas in 1898 had the second highest death rate of the Spanish-American War due to a typhoid epidemic that swept through the camp. It closes in 98, starts to revert back to being the battlefield. The Army decides they need a permanent presence in the area, and so Fort Oglethorpe is established outside the perimeter of the park. And in Army parlance, a fort is a permanent installation, a camp is a temporary installation. So from 1903 up until the beginning of the First World War, the Army at Fort Oglethorpe would use this as their training and maneuver grounds. So the infantry and the cavalry would come here and train and move around. When World War I begins, of course, the Army now has to expand to an incredibly large number of troops very quickly, and they start centralizing training. So in the instance of what becomes Camp Greenleaf here, the Army Medical Training Center, medical training was spread sort of across the country in various posts. If you were a surgeon, you went to here. If you were a veterinarian, you went here. Well, when Camp Greenleaf is formed, all Army Medical comes here. So every surgeon, every doctor, every veterinarian, every dentist comes through here, and many of those men eventually end up in France in field hospitals and so on. If you were an enlisted man, the dental technicians, the medics, all of those people also come here and train. You also have the ambulance corps, horse-drawn and motorized, that are brought here. And in addition to that, the band from Fort Riley, Kansas is brought here. And the reason that the band is brought here is in the old Army, your bandsmen were also stretcher bearers. And so they were also sent when their medical detachment moved from Kansas here as well. So Camp Greenleaf is the largest part of the Army camp, the Army footprint here at Chickamauga Battlefield. Camp Forest was a combat engineer camp. Camp Forest is actually here where we are at Snodgrass Hill. And then where the Visitors Center is was an area called Camp Warden McLean, and that entire open field was the Officer Training Center, an OTC. It was named Warden McLean for a lieutenant who was training an artillery battery, and he had been given a horse that had not been broken properly, and it went wild, bucked him headfirst into a tree and killed him. And he was the son of a prominent Indiana newspaper publisher, so they named the camp in his honor. It stays Camp Warden McLean for about the first 6 months it's in operation, but then as Camp Greenleaf continued to expand, they took Officer Training Camp away from here, and it became the motor transport area for Camp Greenleaf. And in addition to the three main camps, there's other training going on here. There are infantry units that are being trained here, machine gun units, and so on, because we'll find documentation about this machine gun unit, this rifle unit, and so on that were here. But what really amazes people when they find this out is, you come to the park today and it looks rather pastoral. The Army put 1,500 buildings up across this property between 1917 and 1918, and 65,000 men trained here. They dug 6 miles of trenches to replicate France all across this area. There are photographs that show here at Snodgrass Hill trench systems being put in place. And the large open fields that you passed on the way to come up to Snodgrass, just the ones we would find at the bottom as we went back that direction, I've got photographs in there that show the Army camps in those areas and trenches being dug over those hillsides. Of course, when the war ends, Camp Greenleaf is closed down, and they begin to try to turn the park back into the park. And so the trenches are filled back in, the buildings are taken back down. They try to erase that footprint very quickly. But of course, they have drastically changed the landscape. And so when we talk to people here, you have to realize in a lot of areas of the park, what you're seeing today is not what they saw in 1863 at all. It's close. They tried to level things back out and get it that way, but it is not the exact landscape that the Civil War soldiers fought over, especially in some areas of the park. When Camp Greenleaf closes, this just goes back to being a National Guard training center. Every National Guard unit in the area came here for annual training for 2 weeks during the summer. There was an airfield that was in front of Wilder Tower. An observation squadron took off and flew out of there, and there are pictures that show a line of biplanes down in the field. When World War II started, again, the Army is now expanding. This time they had to argue with the Park Service because the Park Service didn't get this property until 1932. So when World War II began, the Park and the Army had to hash out who was getting what and how. But the Army ends up putting a prisoner of war camp. They were going to put it here, and it ended up out in Fort Oglethorpe. but the Women's Army Corps comes here to train. And so down in these woods, you can find foundations for the Wac Barracks. And if you're familiar with the park, you know where the visitor center is. If you came out of that parking lot, turned right, tour stop number 1, which has the road that leads back into the woods, that was the main road that took you into the Wac training camp. And I've got a photograph in my collection that shows the sign that says Wac training area with an arrow. So it is used for a lot all through World War II. And then, of course, when the war ends, Fort Oglethorpe is a small camp. It's been relegated to receiving and reception. And so they decide they don't need it. It's a war surplus camp. It closes in 1947. Rumor has it that in quite a few areas out there along Lafayette Road that there were garbage dumps that were dug. Where the Kmart is, I had an older gentleman tell me that he remembered when the Army dug trenches out there and they dumped 55-gallon drums full of brand new campaign hats, McClellan saddles, all this equipment that wasn't going to be used ever again, and just covered it up. And where the Food City is, same guy told me that it was lined up with trucks and Jeeps and vehicles all off the post being sold for next to nothing just to clear everything out of here. So that is the history of the park, primarily in World War I. And now, if you guys want to look around a little bit, ask some questions, go in there and look at the photographs and kind of get a real visual idea of what it looked like, we invite you to do that. And thanks for coming out.
The Yanks are coming, the drums are coming everywhere. So prepare